Hello and welcome to the Switch for Good podcast. My name is Alexandra Paul and I'm here with my co-host, Dotsie Vausch. Hi, Dotsie.
Hello, hello.
Well, our guest today is a good friend of yours, and you cannot count on a prescription from him because Dr. James Loomis is a whole foods, plant-based internal medicine practitioner who believes that the most important medicine is the food that you put in your mouth. He is the former internist for the St. Louis Rams and the Cardinals, as well as the touring physician for the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra. He currently serves as the medical director of the Barnard Medical Center in Washington, D.C. And when he's not in the office, he puts his medical advice into practice, teaching plant-based cooking classes and training for multi-sport endurance races, including a full Ironman coming up. So we can't wait for him to share all his knowledge with us. Welcome, Dr. Loomis.
Thank you for having me. It's quite the pleasure.
Oh, I'm glad that you're wearing your veggie tie.
Yeah, right. I've got my avocado socks on too, by the way.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen you when we've done presentations together, either not in the tie with the avocado socks. They're good luck, so it's going to be a good interview right now.
So everybody, just so everybody knows, you can find us on YouTube at the Switch for Good YouTube channel.
If you want to see the tie.
And maybe the socks later. Who knows?
I'll
might get crazy.
scare you the socks.
Who knows where we'll go with this? So Dr. Loomis and I were in Atlanta on behalf of Switch for Good, presenting to the Inner Atlanta Football Club to pitch them on Switch for Good being their title sponsor, their largest partner. And I would say that we were speaking to a crowd mostly of people who had just probably never even heard word one of dairy-free or plant-based. It started out, I went first, and then Dr. Loomis backed up my presentation and my ask with some really great, super awesome science that people learned a lot from. But it started out with a lot of men kind of scowling at me with their arms crossed. That's how.
I cannot imagine any man scowling at you, Dotsie.
Am I right, Dr. Loomis? Is that what was
true?
It's true.
It was a skeptical crowd to start with.
Those crazy vegans from California.
Yeah, like why and what, and are you kidding me? It was more of a crowd of people who, more herd mentality, if you will, right? Who have just maybe never quite heard this message and think that it's fringe and it's out there and it doesn't make a lot of sense. And so then they're, I think, thinking there's some conspiracy going on. So it was kind of asking, like, what is this for? What's really behind this? Right. Who's funding you? Like this, inquiry of like this something's behind this that's just not quite right, and it's like, no, there's just a bunch of passion. And we're not, making much money like a, sponsor would be, because they kind of said, do you have an agenda? And you're like, well, yes, goodness and fairness and health and performance.
I think the fundamental problem, whether it be in the community, in the world as a whole, or even in the medical community, is that we, people just do not understand the fundamental importance of food in general. And B, the fundamentally unhealthiness of the standard American diet, which is really based in meat and dairy and highly processed foods. And despite the fact that the science is irrefutable. And in fact, in the talk today, I showed a picture. I said, now think about this. In my lifetime, you could go to the hospital and the doctors would be smoking on rounds. And there would be ashtrays in the patient rooms. The only time you couldn't smoke in a room was that there was oxygen. And that was despite decades of clear and irrefutable evidence that smoking caused cancer, along with a whole plethora of other diseases. Yet today, you can walk into the CCU after someone's had a heart attack or bypass surgery, and they can order bacon and eggs and a glass of milk for breakfast, despite the same kind of decades of clear and irrefutable evidence. And I think we are just so disconnected from food and where our food comes from, that we've got, we've been almost brainwashed by the industry, whether it be the dairy industry, the meat industry, the influence they have on the dietary guidelines is where I used to get my advice, until I was enlightened, 8 or 9 years ago. So I think it really gets, I think what we saw in that room, Dotsie, last week was really fundamentally reflected the attitudes and how far we have drifted from this connection between food and our health and performance and the environment. I mean, and the compassion. I mean, all of it really.
When I left, 2 athletes and 2 coaches and the marketing director all came up to me separately. It was hard to get out of there. I mean, it was not that I was running out, but saying, thank you so much for coming. This is so progressive. We need this so much. Each one of them had their own story of, I've taken some animal foods out slowly, but surely I'm feeling better. It's really interesting to track my performance. This is what our kids and parents need. We really hope this goes through. So there was so much hope from, and I will say that's the younger, it was younger dudes, right? Because they were coaches and athletes and they said, oh man, we're just going to be so thrilled if this happens. So I was like, okay, I wanted to share that with you. So
that's great.
Right now.
That's great news,
yeah.
So one of the reasons you are such a good communicator, Dr. Loomis, with these kind of groups is that not too long ago you were one of them, weren't you? So tell us a little bit about what got you to a plant-based diet.
Sure. Well, it's still true today, unfortunately. Medical students today, and medical students, way back when I was in med school decades ago, we just didn't learn anything about nutrition. Nutrition was really a glorified biochemistry class. We learned about carbohydrates and protein, and we learned what happened if you didn't get enough of those things, and what happens if you didn't get enough vitamins, and the clinical disease states that occurred. But we didn't learn anything about the connection between diet and health, really. And so I viewed myself as kind of, I tried to self-educate myself, but the only resource you really had was the U.S. dietary guidelines, right? So the food pyramid. And the food, you look at the old food pyramid, I mean, there's sweets and oil on the top, and then dairy and ice cream, and then meat, and then, and grains and fruits and vegetables. And, you could have all that stuff in moderation. And that's what I talk to my patients about, and that's kind of the dietary advice I personally followed. And when I reflect back, we talk a lot about moderation. Well, what in retrospect, one of the issues with that was, Monday the nurses are bringing some cookies in the office, and Tuesday there'd be donuts in the doctor's lounge, and Wednesday I go out for a cheeseburger, and Thursday it's someone's birthday, so I'd have a little cake and ice cream, and Friday would roll around and I'd pat myself on the back about how great I ate this week because I didn't have many cookies, right? So, I'm moderating the trees and losing sight of the forest, and I could kind of out-exercise that. I had been I ran track in college. I was a fairly successful road runner in med school in the early 80s. Started doing some triathlons in the late 80s, but then got married and had kids and kind of got away from all that. Still tried to stay active. But in the fall of 2010, I tore my meniscus plant with my knee, and I had to wait about 3 months to get it fixed just because I was really busy. And then, like most doctors, I was a terrible patient, and I didn't do the rehab. And next thing I know, I started to gain weight. And the first thing that happened is I started to develop an irregular heartbeat, atrial fibrillation. So I had a cardiologist, and he gave me some pills. And it turns out the atrial fibrillation was because I had developed sleep apnea from the weight gain. And so I had a sleep doctor, and he gave me a really sexy CPAP machine to wear, right? And then I go finally and get a physical, and my cholesterol's through the roof. I got borderline diabetes. And all my doctors are just giving me stuff. They're treating me just like I treated my patients, at the time, how I was taught. And again, that's what we call healthcare today, but it's not healthcare, right? Patient comes in, like take me as an example. You come in and you got AFib, and we give you some pills. Well, then it turns out it's from sleep apnea, so you get a machine, and then you got high cholesterol, and you get some more pills. And then, the path I was on already had prediabetes. I can guarantee you in the next 4 or 5 years, I would have been on pills for my diabetes. And then I would have had blood pressure issues. And that's what we add years to our patients' lives in that system, but we're taking away life from their years at every step of the way. We're waiting for them to get sick, and we give them drugs that have side effects, and we allow them to accumulate diabetes and cancer and, disability. And, I kind of knew in the back of my mind that something wasn't right. But not one of my physicians, and I trained at Washington University in St. Louis, and my doctors were all highly trained, well-respected world experts even in their field. Not once did any of them talk to me about my diet. And one day, I was laying on the couch, and I had a prescription for statin, prescription medication for cholesterol medication in my wallet, and I stumbled across on Netflix Forks Over Knives. And I'm like, wow, you mean food is medicine? I mean, really? And it was such a kind of a profound enlightenment, if you will. And like many people, we all have, including myself at the time, we all have a lot of cognitive dissonance of where our food comes from. And I knew what a vegan was at the time, but my perception of someone who's vegan, you're wearing Birkenstocks and tie-dye and hugging trees and, on and on. And I never really made the connection between food and kind of the ethics and compassion that goes from where our food comes from. And that came as I transitioned to a plant-based diet. But I started this solely for my own health. And within 3 months, without really any change in exercise other than just getting my knee back in shape, I finally got the rehab I should have done, before. I lost 30, 40 pounds. My cholesterol went from 260 to 150. My sleep apnea went away. The AFib went away. I had lifelong seasonal allergies and exercise-induced asthma. If I would go run when it was below about 50 degrees, I would cough and wheeze at the end and have to hit the inhaler. All that just disappeared. And I'm like, wait a minute, right? Again, how come I didn't learn this in med school again? And that's when I realized what healthcare really was. And, when we talk about the ability to add years to our patients' life and sustain life in their years, right? We all got to die. You just don't want it to be your fault, right? And so once you focus on the root cause of all these chronic diseases, that's when we can practice true healthcare. And so what's the root cause of every single problem I had? 90% of the cause was the food I was putting in my mouth and how much I moved and exercised and how I coped with stress and, alcohol and tobacco, which I drank some beer, but I didn't smoke. But the food primarily is what was derailing the train, if you will. And as I started to experience personally this almost miraculous kind of transformation, I began to try to incorporate that into my practice in St. Louis. Well, St. Louis is a great place to get sick, but it was very difficult. There was no dietitians that were plant-based. I would see a patient and talk to them about a plant-based diet, and then they'd go see a dietitian who would tell them they need to drink milk to get their calcium, or you got to eat meat to get protein. I had diabetes doctors accuse me of malpractice for curing their patients' diabetes because you do that, which is crazy. So an opportunity came to move to Washington D.C. 3 years ago to work with Neil Barnard, who opened the Barnard Medical Center, and I moved here to be the medical director, and so that's my story.
How did your seasonal allergies disappear after you went plant-based?
Yeah, so it's very interesting, and so that's the thing that didn't make sense to me. Right?
Yeah.
I expected to lose weight. I'd done a little reading, and I expected to lose weight, and I expected my cholesterol to go down. I was hoping the sleep apnea would get better when I lost weight, and all that stuff happened. But what I didn't expect was exactly that. I had no idea. We're talking years of allergies, 10 months out of the year, and sprays and shots and, antihistamines and on and on. And so when I started to look into it, it really was fascinating to me. It turns out if you really peel back the onion on all these chronic diseases, what you get to in the middle is inflammation. And that the standard American diet is highly, highly inflammatory. And so it has to do with the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3s in our diet and the inability to mitigate oxidative stress because we don't get enough dietary antioxidants. But probably just as important is especially for diseases like allergies and asthma, which is really kind of an autoimmune disease. It's our immune system gets kind of jacked up. It's not autoimmune in the sense we're not reacting to ourselves, but it's an immune disease in the sense that we're overreacting to antigens, to proteins that trigger allergies. And it turns out a lot of those antigens are coming in through our gut because of what we eat, and probably include things like casein, milk proteins, and other environmental toxins that leak from our gut because we populate our gut with unhealthy gut bacteria. And so when you move to a plant-based diet, there's two fundamental things that happen. The diet itself becomes anti-inflammatory, and then we
It's a
heal our
whole
gut. So it
foods.
stops
I think we need to just emphasize it needs to be a whole foods plant-based
No,
diet.
exactly.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. And so
Not a
the analogy, when I talk to patients about it, I talk about a house, right? So think about a house. Each room in the house is an organ system. So we have a brain room, a skin room, a heart room, a joint room, a respiratory room. And we fill that house up with angry people when we eat an inflammatory diet. And if a stranger wanders in the room, it's not going to be a good outcome, right? So they come in the skin room, you end up with eczema or psoriasis, right? They come in the joint room, you end up with rheumatoid arthritis or even osteoarthritis. They come in the respiratory room, you end up with asthma or allergies. You come in the brain room, you get Alzheimer's or multiple sclerosis. Where are these strangers coming from? They're probably primarily coming from our gut because our gut leaks. Now, we breathe some of it in, but a lot of it comes from our gut, especially the dairy antigens. Gluten probably as well. So what happens when you go on a whole food plant-based? And you're exactly right. It has to be whole food plant-based because the only way you're going to get that omega-6, omega-3 ratio back down is you got to eliminate the meat and dairy, and you got to really cut back or eliminate as much of the processed oils, the edible oils that we're really not designed to eat. And that happens pretty quickly. So you replace those angry people in the house with people drinking green tea and listening to Mozart. And then it takes about 4 to 6 weeks, depending on how disrupted your gut flora is, you will actually heal your gut. You will repopulate your gut flora. And that's where you really got to get all in because, it's not about more kale and less ice cream because the bacteria that like to digest that milk sugar and the high-fat foods, they're not going anywhere if you eat that stuff in moderation. You got to get all in for 3 or 4 months to reset the gut flora. And once you did that, now you've shut the front door. And increasingly, every week in the medical literature, there's a new study looking at the effects of plant-based diets on a whole plethora of autoimmune diseases, asthma, rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis, allergies, multiple sclerosis, on and on and on. And it's, and what's so amazing about this whole thing really is that 90% of the chronic problems that walk in this office every single day, obesity, high blood pressure, autoimmune diseases, cholesterol, breast cancer risk, colon cancer risk, depression, anxiety, all of it is fundamentally related to the food we put in our mouths and then how much we move and stress. And almost every one of those things will respond to a whole food plant-based diet. And there's science behind all of it. And extra added bonus, we don't kill the planet, we're not only, and extra added bonus, we're not torturing animals to get the food. And so it's such a simple thing. It's just not easy.
How did you do it? How did you do it? Because it sounds like you did it you saw forks over knives, and that was
went
that.
all in. I came back the next day. I looked up a little bit of I got online. I was on the faculty at WashU. I got on the library computer, read a couple articles, and by the end of the day, I was done. I was in. I went and cleaned out my refrigerator, cleaned out my pantry, and it just went just literally overnight.
And how do you tell your patients to do that too? Because I think one of the problems is people they struggle with what am I going to eat for breakfast, or what can I? How do you encourage them to make the switch?
Well, that takes some time, and you really have to meet them where they are. For some patients, there has been kind of this aha moment where they're ready to jump all in. Some patients aren't ready, and so you have to kind of walk them through. And so I really design a change plan. We have dietitians here on our staff. We offer free educational classes to our patients. So, some patients dive all in. Some patients, it may take a few months to get all in. But any meat you don't eat, any dairy you don't drink is going to provide a positive health benefit. Even going meatless Mondays is better than not, right? So, the ultimate goal is to get people to really understand. And the thing is, I tell them, you just test drive this for a few weeks, and I can guarantee you're going to feel so amazing that the problem cures itself, really.
I want to ask you about bro science. Let me get you to explain some bro science here, really, which is just based on, nothing, except for
Right.
the iterations of the
Except for the bros,
conversations
right?
that the bros have been having in the gym and on the track and on the court for over a period of time. Is you served as the team doctor for the St. Louis Rams and Cardinals. You have
Yep.
a Super Bowl and a World Series ring, which is rather cool. But you were not, this is before your transition. This
Right.
is before
That's right.
you really knew all that you know now. And you said the players were eating, large slabs of animals and, some
Protein
bread
shakes,
and some protein
whey
shakes.
protein,
And
and on, yeah.
yeah. I want to hear about the perpetuation of bro science within those ball clubs and how you explain bro science and how you explain to people that is not actual science.
Right. So, it's interesting. And this has been looked at. So if you look at where athletes get their nutrition advice, it's not from doctors, right? And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is they don't trust the doctors. And two is the doctors don't know what they're talking about, right? For the most part. And so if you look, the place they get their nutrition advice is from their teammates or the strength and conditioning coach, right? That's the primary source. And that's how this bro science gets perpetuated. This idea that I got to eat big slabs of meat to get big and strong. And so you go to a pregame meal for the Rams. Our games were at noon, so we would, the pregame meal would be 8 or so in the morning. I mean, there would be steak and chicken breast and pasta because you got to have your carbs and you got to have your protein. You go to the weight room, the Cardinals weight room in the locker room, there'd be blenders around the weight room with big tubs of whey protein because everybody's got to get their protein shake, right? And frankly, kind of destroying the bro science myths around protein is very difficult because, they see these teammates in the moment and they are big and strong and they do have big muscles. What they don't see is what happens to their teammates 20 years down the line, when they're dead or they've got diabetes or they've got colon cancer or they got prostate cancer. I mean, I think the average lifespan of an offensive lineman in the NFL is 50 something years old, which is,
that's you right now.
What's that?
I mean, the relatable, that's you right now in your early,
yeah,
right?
I'll be 60 in July, actually.
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
It is hard, but, I think more and more, as you know, more and more athletes are starting to come around. And it's very interesting. So you talk to Derek Morgan, who's with the Tennessee Titans, and listen to his story. I mean, his wife is a vegan chef, and so he decided to go plant-based. And at first, all of his teammates were making fun of him. Oh, you're going to shrivel up, and, it's not manly, and on and on. And next thing you know, halfway through the season, he's not in the training room every day. He's having the best season he's ever had. He's hitting the weight room harder and recovering faster. And these same guys that are making fun of him are coming up kind of on the sly, on the down low, and asking him, hey, now what is it you're doing again? And next thing you know, he's got half the team on a plant-based diet, and the Tennessee Titans went to the playoffs for the first time. And
I wanted to just touch on a couple things that you mentioned earlier. One was somebody questioning how you could get enough calcium if you didn't drink dairy. And I'm sure the same question, and I'd like you to also answer the same question about protein if you don't eat meat, because even though we address it almost every show here, I think it needs to be addressed because there's such a resistance to hearing.
Well, at a very kind of fundamental level, I ask a simple question. When I get that question, I ask a simple question back. I ask athletes or patients, I said, let me ask you, the last time you turned on National Geographic and you saw a special on mountain gorillas or elephants, what's the first thing that popped in your mind? Oh my God, where do they get their protein? Right? Of course not. It's some of the biggest, strongest animals on earth. And what do they eat? I mean, they eat plants. So this mythology that we got to eat meat to get protein is just not true. Right? And people are like, well, I never thought of it that way. And then I kind of point out that, so you want some protein, so you're going to eat a big steak. Where did that protein come from? Right? Well, it came from the cow. Okay, well, where did the cow get the protein from? Well, from the grass. So because we're not starved for calories, we have the luxury of skipping the middleman because the cow has already used all the good stuff. right? Used all the fiber and the vitamins and nutrients to run its own machine, and they just leave us with protein and fat. Why don't we go straight to the source and provide ourselves with complete nutrition, the nutrient-dense foods that the cow ate or the elephant ate or the gorilla ate to fuel themselves? So why do we have to skip, why do we skip the middleman? So, and then if they're still resistant, you can get into the math. I mean, if you look at the RDA for protein, it's about 0.8 grams per kilogram. Okay. Mm-hmm. So the natural macronutrient ratios of a plant-based diet are 75% carbs, 15% protein, about 10% fat. So if you do the math backwards, so your average size, you're eating your kind of average activity, you're eating 1,800 calories a day. The amount of protein that provides is right at 0.8 grams per kilogram, right? But say you're training for a marathon, right? I mean, you're not eating 1,800 calories. You might be eating 3,200 calories, 3,600 calories. Well, guess what's happened to your protein intake in that situation? It's doubled to 1.6, right?
Because you're eating twice as many calories. Exactly.
And the research would show that an endurance athlete needs between 1.2 and about 1.6 grams per kilogram. You're a strength-trained athlete, you might need a little closer to 2, but guess what? You're a professional bodybuilder, you're eating 3,000 or 4,000 calories a day. So you're going to get all the protein you need. It's not protein you worry about, it's calories, right? And if you get enough calories, you're going to get enough protein. And I have a little calculator that I share with Paige. I have a spreadsheet I made with calculators. So I'll sit them down and walk them through what that looks like. And they're like, wow, okay, I never thought of that. I didn't know that. And also educating them about there are adverse effects of the overconsumption of protein. We know that, we can store extra fat, we can store extra carbohydrate, we can't store extra protein. And whatever protein, after we've used up the protein, after we've used the protein we need to repair our muscles or build muscle, repair our tissue, kind of day-to-day maintenance, that gets converted to nitrogen and excreted in our kidneys. So we know that excess protein intake puts a strain on our kidneys, has been associated over the long term with kidney disease. Most of the animal-based protein sources that we consume have high levels of IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor, especially in dairy products. Because remember, milk is a biologic fluid that's designed to take a baby mammal and turn it into a mammal big enough to go find food on its own. And each species milk is designed to meet that species' needs. So cow's milk takes 70-pound cows and turns them into 500 or 600-pound cows before they can go find food on their own. Mm-hmm. And it takes a lot of protein and sugar and growth factors to do that. And we know that the overconsumption of IGF-1, particularly in dairy products, has been associated with an increased risk for cancer, heart disease, because it is an anabolic compound.
And what does that mean, an anabolic compound?
Oh, it builds muscle. It promotes tissue growth.
Got it.
So, the problem is you don't want to, when you over-promote tissue growth, it turns into cancer, right? So that's the problem.
And what about calcium? What do you say to folks who say?
Well, it's the same thing. Where did the calcium come from in the milk? Well, it came from the grass that they actually came from the dirt, right? So it's the same issue. There's as much calcium in a cup of collard greens as there is in a cup of milk, right? Yeah. And, tofu is coagulated soy milk. It's soybean curds. How do you coagulate it? With calcium carbonate, which is gypsum. So there's high levels of calcium in tofu. Mm-hmm. So we do need calcium for strong bones, but you don't need to get that from milk. And there's some evidence that you look at population data. Countries with the highest amount of dairy consumption have the highest rates of osteoporosis. Mm. And in theory, when we consume protein, we break down the protein. Protein's made up of amino acids, and those are the proteins broken down in our digestive tract. And what we actually absorb are these amino acids. Some amino acids, especially the ones that have sulfur on them, are more acidic than others. When we overconsume protein in general and milk specifically because it has a higher level of these sulfated amino acids, it lowers the pH of our blood, and our bodies really do a great job maintaining a very narrow pH range. And so when we over-acidify our blood, we have to neutralize that acid. Now, before they had the little purple pill, if you had heartburn, what would you take? Well, you take Tums, right? So Tums is calcium carbonate. So when we want to de-acidify our blood or offset that acid, what do? Well, we need calcium. Where does it come from? It comes from our bones. And so that's one of the theories about why the overconsumption of dairy products in particular, but protein in general, can lead to higher rates of osteoporosis.
Yeah. There's I think a question out there that is just kind of runs congruent all the time with drinking cow's milk as humans. And I think most people can conceptualize and understand that, okay, yeah, we are the only species that drinks the mother's milk of another species as adults. Like that just, okay, yeah, that doesn't make much sense. I still like it, but you'd still have to convince me otherwise, but that doesn't make sense. But what does make sense to mothers, it made sense to my mother, I think it made sense to your mother, is that after they wean their babies off of their milk, it makes sense for them to just have another milk because they were having milk. But what is so dangerous about cow's milk is something that you just touched on, is the speed and the rate of growth of the baby cow versus our rate of growth, which is really quite slow. And the amount of protein, casein and whey, specifically casein, in a liter of cow's milk is about 26 grams. It's about 3 grams in a human mother's milk. So that just kind of shows you that difference there. So why is it specifically not good for 3-year-old baby Johnny to be having cow's milk?
Right. Well, you look at, if you read the book, The China Study by T. Colin Campbell, which has addresses this casein issue very specifically. We know that casein, again, it appears to have almost a carcinogenic anabolic effect, which can contribute to cancer. And I mean, and to your point, we had to domesticate. We did the only milk we had access to for hundreds of thousands of years was our mother's milk, and we had to domesticate other mammals to get access to their milk, and that didn't occur till 7,000 or 8,000 years ago. That's a blink of an eye in our evolutionary heritage. So for all of human existence, except for this last little few, seconds on our evolutionary timeline, we didn't even have access to other mammals' milk, right? And so it just doesn't make sense to me that we are not designed to use dairy. I mean, look at the enzyme that digests milk sugar, lactase. That gene that makes lactase is designed to turn off around age 4 or 5, because historically that's when we would wean, around that age. And if you look at the world population today, that's exactly what happens. 75% of the world population today becomes lactose intolerant around age 4 or 5. Now, sometimes that it can manifest a little bit later in life. So, I see patients all the time who come in and they've got, they're bloating and they've got diarrhea and they got gas all the time. They can't, they go on a gluten-free diet because they figure that's what's going on, because that's what, that's the kind of the health fad of the day. But it turns out they're lactose intolerant because we're not designed to drink milk. The only reason that a small population, it's mainly Caucasians, it's about 20%, 25% of the population today, the only reason that a very small percentage can still even digest milk sugar into later life is that there was a genetic mutation at around the time we domesticated other mammals was at the end of the last ice age. And so it was harder to find plant-based proteins because of climate change. And so there was a mutation in a population of people that caused lactase persistence and allowed that small group to continue to digest milk sugar because of the survival advantage it provided. That gene got passed into a small part of the population. So, I mean, again, you look at the evolution, kind of the anthropologic evidence. You look at the scientific evidence. I mean, across the board, there are the only studies that show that there's a benefit to drinking dairy are the studies funded by the dairy industry, right? Which is a huge issue when we try to kind of tease all this stuff out. But I think if you look objectively across the whole body of evidence, you look at the anthropologic evidence, the scientific evidence around health. You start looking at the environment, the effect that dairy cows have on the environment. There's absolutely no reason that human beings should be drinking cow's milk in general, and specifically, or any other mammal's milk for that matter.
Mm-hmm. And the life of a dairy cow is horrendous. It's worse than a beef cow, truly. It's longer, but torturous. You mentioned omega-6s and 3s.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that? People hear about that and
Yeah.
think they start taking fish oil.
Yeah.
And I want to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so omega-6 fatty acids, we typically ingest dietary sources of omega-6 and omega-3 is what are called short-chain fatty acids. And they get metabolized to long-chain fatty acids. And it's arachidonic acid on the omega-6 side and EPA-DHA on the omega-3 side, which is what in fish oil. And those serve as precursors for either anti-inflammatory compounds on the omega-3 side or inflammatory compounds called prostaglandins or leukotrienes on the omega-6 side.
Which we sometimes want. Is that right?
Well, yeah, no, that's exactly right. We have to have inflammation, right? Because we have to be able to fight infections and heal wounds and things like that to survive. And in fact, we have an evolutionary preference for inflammation. If our bodies have a choice, we'll make more omega-6 than omega-3 because we have a lot of protections against starving to death. We have no protections against the other end of overnutrition. So you can imagine if you're starving to death and you got to go find your next meal before you die and you cut your foot. I mean, you got to heal that. You have to stay healthy enough to find your next meal. So it's felt the ideal dietary ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 is about 3 to 5 to 1. Omega-6 to omega-3. So we're designed to take in more omega-6 than omega-3. But here's the problem. Standard American diet, 40 to 50 to 1 omega-6 to omega-3.
Yowza.
Yeah, highly inflammatory. Now, these are all plant-based, actually. We talk about fish oil, but up the food chain, it comes from marine phytoplankton and algae. On the omega-6 side, we talk about dairy and cattle, but actually the omega-6s are generated by what we feed those animals, okay? And even on a vegan diet, it can still be highly inflammatory because a lot of the processed vegetable oils, even olive oil, it's about 13 to 2 omega-6 to omega-3, which is above that ratio. Corn oil, right, so we feed animals today, even fish now, corn-based diets, and they mix corn oil in that to get the calorie counts up, is 83 to 1. Omega-6 to omega-3, probably the most highly inflammatory edible oil that's out there, and so that's why the standard American diet is so highly inflammatory. Now, here's the problem with the fish oil. The enzymes we ingest these short chain fatty acids and they get elongated down this kind of metabolic pathway, and the enzymes that do that are shared between both sides, okay? And so if you're taking in a ton of omega-6, those enzymes are busy on that side because, again, we have this evolutionary preference. So we can't convert enough of the omega-3s down to the long-chain omega-3 fatty acids. You can't take enough. You'd have to drink gallons of fish oil to bring that. If your ratio is 50 to 1, you'd have to drink a lot of fish oil to bring that up. And even if that ratio up, and even if you did, the enzymes might not be available because they're hard at work on the omega-6 side creating inflammation because it thinks you need to survive to your next meal. So the only way you get that back in balance is you have to lower your omega-6 intake significantly and increase your omega-3, and that frees up the enzymes to allow the omega-3s to be converted. And so there's, the plant-based sources of omega-3s are things like walnuts and fish and hemp seeds and flax seeds and things like that. So there's plenty of dietary sources of omega-3s.
But what I'm hearing is that we need to get rid of some traditionally plant-based processed foods like oils from our diet. Everybody needs to do that.
Yeah. So, when I talk to patients, I do make a distinction between a tradition, what we think of as a vegan diet and a plant-based diet. Veganism historically comes from an ethical place around not wearing animal products, not using products tested on animals, not eating animal products. But on the dietary side, the sole kind of criteria for inclusion in the diet or not is, are there animal products? There are a lot of really unhealthy vegan foods, right? White flour, sugar, corn oil, Oreos. So a plant-based diet is vegan because there's no animal products, but it also minimizes or eliminates these highly processed foods. I mean, in the modern world, it is a little hard to get rid of it completely, but for certain patients, especially those with type 2 diabetes, you do have to get kind of all in at first to really fix that problem. So when I talk to patients, I don't really talk about being vegan. I talk about plant-based because I want them to understand that from a health standpoint, these highly processed foods. And again, I try to think about all this through the lens of our evolutionary biology. This idea, there's no such thing as a paleo diet, despite what you hear, but there were certainly ancestral dietary patterns. And in temperate climates where our ancestors came from, we were not hunter-gatherers, right? We were gatherer-hunters. And what we gathered was whole food, unprocessed sources of energy, probably 75 or 80% of our calories, roots, stems, leaves, seeds, fruits, nuts, vegetables, berries, legumes. That is what we're designed to put in our gas tanks, right? Mm-hmm. We are not designed to, there was no white flower tree or canola oil bush or Dr. Pepper root, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, we are not designed to consume this highly processed edible oils, highly processed sugars. And, again, you think about your car. If your car runs on regular unleaded, you don't put diesel gas in moderation, right? That'd be a very expensive mistake to make. We spend $3.6 trillion on healthcare. I would suggest 2/3 of that is spent repetitively fixing people's cars because they keep putting diesel gas in a car designed to run on regular unleaded. So, and again, if you play that out, I mean, dairy wasn't in the mix because we hadn't domesticated mammals. We did eat meat. It just wasn't very much. And the meat we ate came from animals that ate what animals were supposed to eat, not cows and pigs and chickens, stuffed full of corn, antibiotics, and hormones, and God knows what else. Now, arguably, those ancestors had a survival advantage to having that concentrated animal fat and protein because they needed to get big and strong and find a mate and get away from the leopard before they died of some infectious disease when they were 30. And through sanitation and antibiotics, we tripled our lifespan, which has unmasked all these chronic problems that we talked about earlier, heart disease and stroke and cancer and on, all of which have been associated with the overconsumption of animal products, meat, dairy, and then these processed foods. You take one step further back and think about the environmental consequences of how we raise those animals, how we treat those animals. You can make, I think you can make an irrefutable argument, if you're not starved for calories, again, that a whole food plant-based diet is the optimal diet for human health, planetary health, and obviously for the animals. So that's how I frame this discussion to my patients about what does it mean to be healthy. And it's really about replicating the lifestyle that we are designed to lead as human beings. That's kind of a long answer to your question, but
that was awesome.
I'd like to talk.
Can we talk a little bit about research then?
Yeah.
Yeah, because dietary research and scientific research, we definitely want to always be aware and know the research behind promoting a plant-based diet. And a lot of times that you will hear, let's just call it from the other side. People say, this is great dairy research, though, that shows that it's a really healthy material and keeps us strong and keeps our bones strong and yada, yada, yada. And something that I have learned along that route of digging deep into plant-based science research and dairy research and all different kinds of nutrition research is that it is always critical that you ask, in comparison to what? So when a research study comes out and the findings are that this, whatever it might be, this plant or this, this cheese is just fantastic for you, you want to ask what they are comparing it to.
Right.
And it's helped me to be a more critical thinker in almost everything I come across, even commercials on TV. It's the first thing that came to mind after I really learned this is watching car commercials, and they'll say, this car is voted the safest car of 2018 by Car and Drivers. And beforehand, I used to go, oh, cool. Yeah, that's a safe car. Let's call it a Volvo. They like to do that commercial. And then I realized, well, did they compare it to a 57 Chevy? Did they compare it to their kid's motorcycle that's out in the driveway that's made of plastic? Like, really, they could have. And you have to ask these really critical questions. And what I've learned mostly about dairy research in almost every case is they're comparing it to the standard American diet, not against like a plant-based diet. So if you're comparing something to, McDonald's for breakfast, Burger King for lunch, and Taco Bell for dinner, is that really something that came out better than that, what you want to lean towards? No, of course not.
And the other issue along those same lines is what they're substituting for, right? So, if you take dairy out and you substitute bacon, or whatever from calories. I mean, it's to your point about what are you comparing to, and oftentimes what ends up happening is, there's so many variables, and when you compare it against something that's relatively unhealthy, you're going to get a healthy source. Or you compare this against something that doesn't do anything, right? Like we talked a little about that chocolate milk study that came out a couple years ago about chocolate milk and performance. And, there were so many red flags in that study. I mean, it was like 8 people, number one. And there's no way you can even interpret a study that has 8 people. To get statistical significance, you got to have way, more people in a study. And they were comparing to things like water.
Yeah.
And
water.
Things like that. So,
and they were saying, what was the conclusion they were touting?
Chocolate milk is a wonderful recovery drink.
Yeah, it enhances recovery. Well, versus water, probably
has a
does.
calorie.
So the other thing is, as you know, you can really, you have to be very careful too. Say I have this great new, say I want to tout dairy as something that could prevent cancer, right? And the research says that there's a 30% increase in cancer risk, right? And a 70% people don't get cancer and 30% do, right? Mm-hmm. So you can spin that 2 ways. You can say, look at this study, 70% of the people who drank milk didn't get cancer, right? Isn't that great? Right? Mm-hmm. Or if I'm on the other side, I could say, look at this, milk is terrible. Look at this, 30% of the people that drank milk got cancer. So you have to be very careful about, and so that gets to looking at where the funding came from, because you have to be very careful about how people spin the data, right, to tell the story they want to tell. And oftentimes, many of these studies are highly biased, and the funding source is a very important place to look at. Dr. Michael Greger at nutritionfacts.org has a great kind of a layman's a series of talks on his website about how to interpret medical literature, which is a great resource for people who want to learn. And also Dr. David Katz has a new book out called, I think it's, he's at Yale. We serve on the board of directors of American College of Lifestyle Medicine together. And it's called, I think, Pandas Eat Bamboo, People Get Bamboozled, the truth about nutrition. And he does an excellent job about looking at all the many of the fallacies that crop up in dietary research, why dietary research is so difficult to do. The gold standard of research is around a double-blind controlled study. Well, you can't really do that over a long period of time with nutrition. So we have to rely on population-based studies, which the paleo folks go crazy about. He does a great job. That's a great read, really helping you kind of become an educated citizen, if you will. Because the media, the media is the worst. I mean, they take stuff and spin it out of context, and the whole butter is back thing a few years ago, made the cover of Time magazine. In no way, shape, or form did that research suggest butter is good for you. So anyway, but you're right. You have to be very careful about where you're getting your information, where the information came from. And I'm talking about scientific research, not to mention all the other stuff that's out there on the internet. It makes me insane. I can't even get on Twitter and follow some of these carnivore paleo guys. It makes me insane because you can't. It just doesn't. I just want to scream, and I don't have time for all that. So,
well, they never talk about like you did so candidly about their cholesterol numbers, or I noticed, or their blood pressure or anything like that.
It's more of how they feel right now today.
Yeah,
that's right. How they look in the mirror, they're big and strong.
Right.
That kind of stuff.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being on our show. It's really been wonderful to speak with you.
I got to ask one last question about your nutrition, because I'm always so fascinated with, you're really just you're a chef in a veggie tie and a doctor outfit.
I don't know, chef. I'm a cook. I'm a cook.
You're almost. And I got my air fryer because you suggested it, and I'm doing all sorts of fun things with the air fryer. But this past week we were discussing kind of like your favorite shake that you make, as you're training for an Ironman, and sometimes you're finished training at 9:00 at night and you just want to make a shake, and it just had all these anti-inflammatory foods in it. Tell us your shake, and then we'll let you go.
Yeah, so one thing, just as an aside, one thing that's been remarkable for me, my first marathon I ran in med school. I was 24 years old. It took me probably 3 or 4 weeks to recover from that, all the soreness and stiffness. Second marathon I ran 35 years later, I was running 2 days later, right? And so a plant-based diet, because of this, the antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, does amazing things for athletic performance. And so after a hard workout, I'll take some almond milk, or actually tart cherry juice. Typically after a hard workout, tart cherry juice has been shown to decrease, because of its anti-inflammatory, antioxidant, delayed onset muscle soreness. Tart cherry juice, frozen bananas. I throw in a big handful of kale or spinach, a big handful of blueberries or raspberries or whatever I got hanging around. I'll throw in a teaspoon of turmeric, a teaspoon of ginger, a teaspoon of cinnamon. Sometimes I put some cocoa nibs in there, all of which are highly, highly antioxidant and anti-inflammatory. And I tell you, like this weekend, I had a pretty hard training weekend. You know, I ran 9-10 miles on Saturday, rode 35 healing miles on Sunday, and then swam 2,700 yards. And, you know, I mean, yesterday, I'm not sore, I'm not stiff, and I'll be 60 years old here in a few weeks. And to me, that's crazy. The Ironman thing is crazy. I'll grant you that, right? but the fact that at my age I can do these things, especially compared to where I was a few years ago, and you know, just to end, I think the message I'm trying to send with being able to perform this way and share this message is we truly have the ability to separate out our chronologic age from our biologic age, right? So I'm always going to be older tomorrow than I am today chronologically, but I am much younger today than I was. I will be younger tomorrow than I am today because of the food that I eat and the lifestyle that I live. And there are not enough drugs in the pharmacy that can provide that opportunity to people, right? I mean, which is really astounding, and that our lifestyle really and truly does allow us to become younger next year. So,
Amen, my friend. Okay, now we can end.
Thank you so much, Dr. Loomis, for all your
right.
expertise
Thank you.
and sharing it with us.
So thank you so much for tuning in today. If we helped you in any way, then click the subscribe button and let's keep hanging out together. We have so much more to share with you.
And if you need more information on actually making the switch for good, please visit us at switchforgood.org for loads of info. And you can subscribe to our mailing list where you will receive all sorts of super cool gifts, discount codes to our very fave dairy-free products, and a lifetime of powerful health tips.
So join us on the journey to switch for good. This is the future.